Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, I should say, rather, everybody. It's absolutely fantastic to be here in front of an audience of people who are dynamic, energetic, can-do, and actually get out there and make and sell things. Because sometimes I get a bit impatient when I hear people droning and moaning about the state of the world. And I hear them warn that the sky is about to fall on our heads, or not inconsiderably likely to fall on our heads. And I feel like saying, come off it, sunshine. Every generation hears its prognostications of gloom. And look at us today. We are living longer than ever before. We are healthier than ever before. The quality of the air quality in London, I'm bound to say, is getting steadily better, thanks to decisive action by the previous mayor. And indeed, I must say, and indeed, for all I know, by the current mayor. And thanks to the miracles of commerce, thanks to the energies and enterprise of everybody in this room, we have access to comforts, technological comforts, some of which you're using to take pictures of me or indeed consult in the hope of finding something more interesting. We have access to comforts that previous generations would have found absolutely mind-boggling. And it is entirely thanks to free market capitalism that our food is better than ever before. And you look unbelievably full of beans and healthy. And I'm sure you all ate fruit for breakfast. Can you cast your minds back to breakfast? You're also young and thrusting that you probably don't remember the time I do when pineapples came only in a tin with a kind of gloopy syrup. And pineapples were thought so generally exotic 100 years ago that architects would place them as finials on the top of railings or pillars or other architectural features. And there are plenty of examples of those fruits outside this room on the streets of Westminster. But today, there is a force that brings the pineapple and the papaya and the guava and the melon to London every night, and there is a wind beneath the wings of the 10:30 flight from Accra in Ghana. And actually, I caught that flight myself in the last couple of weeks. I literally physically sat on top of 13 tons of chilled fruit, packed and ready to be distributed to the stores of London. And the same, I can tell you authoritatively, that the same sliced fresh pineapple, retailing at rather different prices, depending on whether it is going to Aldi or to Waitrose, is turning up in our shops the following morning. And there's nothing wrong with the differential in prices, by the way, of course. It's called branding, isn't it? And what is the benign force, the wind beneath the wings of that plane? What's allowing that to happen? What do you say? Globalization. Thank you very much. Globalization. And today, globalization is a word that is acquiring negative overtones, and it's become a sort of boo word in the political lexicon. And so this afternoon, I want to reclaim globalization. And I want to show you all that this is a positive force and that a global Britain is a prosperous Britain. And the agenda of the Prime Minister, Theresa May, and the government is a cause that is more important than ever. Because trade, for the first time in decades, is declining as a proportion of the growth of global GDP. And for the first time, we are seeing protectionist measures on the rise across the world. And as everybody knows and has been endlessly discussed, we are seeing a series of related but by no means identical political events in which populations are said to be rebelling against what had been seen as a settled consensus. And people feel that they aren't getting a fair suck of the sauce bottle, as they say in Australia, or the wealth gap is growing. And so there's been a temptation among some politicians to respond in what I think is the wrong way, by hauling up the drawbridge and to call time on globalization. And I think that instinct is profoundly wrong. And it makes no economic sense, as I'm sure everybody in this room today understands. Those pineapples are good business for Africa. Indeed, the British company that exports them to London is the single biggest private sector employer in Ghana. It's putting food on the tables of some of the poorest families in the continent of Africa. And those pineapples are good for this country too, good for the supermarkets that sell them at whatever price they determine, good for the hauliers that distribute them, the airlines that carry them that might not otherwise have much in their holds. Good indeed, I might say, for every parent who has been unable to persuade their kids to eat pizza unless it has been profaned with pineapple chunks, as they now so often are, to my amazement. History teaches us that if all the economics evidence shows, if we close our markets, if we put up barriers, then we raise the costs for those who can least afford it. We make our industries uncompetitive, we entrench complacency, we discourage investment in capital and technology, we stifle innovation, and of course we breed suspicion and mistrust between nations. And we should never forget the old truism that when goods and services no longer cross borders, then troops and tanks do so instead. And by rebelling against globalization, we endanger a system that has been associated with 70 years of post-war peace and prosperity, and that has allowed billions to lift themselves out of penury by toil and enterprise. Back in 1990, 37% of humanity lived in absolute poverty. Today, thanks to globalization, that figure is less than 10%. And that figure is all the more stunning when you remember that over the same period, the world's population grew by 1.8 billion people. And it's no coincidence that this astonishing success of the global economy coincided with a period in history of unparalleled tearing down of trade barriers. You remember with the completion of the Uruguay round and all that followed. And we are determined to bring back that moment and that inspiration. And under this government, led by Theresa May, Britain is preparing once again to be the leading campaigner for that liberating and enriching force. And let me be absolutely clear, because I know you'll want to ask questions about it afterwards. We can be that great free trading nation again. And we can be ever more internationalist. And indeed, we can be ever more European. But we can change our relationship with the EU from one of membership to one of friendship and partnership. And to use that opportunity to create a regulatory environment that members of the British Chambers of Commerce have been crying out for decades, that precisely suits the needs of British business and commerce, of people in this room, and to be able for the first time in 44 years, as I say, to fulfill the Prime Minister's vision and be the world's leading campaigner for free trade. Because just one thing, I don't want to rerun some of the old arguments, just let me remind you that for all of this period of 44 years of membership, we consecrated our trade policy entirely to the EU Commission, an excellent body of men and women. But it is a melancholy fact that today Britain represents 20% of EU GDP, 12% of the population, and yet we have only 3% of the bureaucrats in Brussels. And I'm afraid I can't pretend to you that we've been turning it around in the last few years. In the last year, in 2016, the last year leading up to the referendum, only one UK national actually succeeded in passing the concours, the exam for the EU services in Brussels. And with all due respect, how can those bodies expect to have the necessary understanding of the needs of UK business and commerce to do the deals that we need? So what we need to do now is work with our partners to ensure that we have a strong EU and a strong UK, connected by a fantastic free trade deal, and one that I think that is manifestly in the interests of both sides. And you will be familiar with the arguments. There's a massive net balance of trade in favour of our friends and partners on the other side of the channel. We are not only the biggest single consumers of German cars, but also, of course, of French champagne, and as I've never tired of telling you, of Italian Prosecco as well, where Prosecco and by no means antipasto, we're absolutely relentless in our consumption of EU products, and that will continue. But we will remain supportive of the EU in all the other important respects in which the UK is currently supportive, on defence cooperation, foreign policy coordination, on counter-terrorism, on intelligence sharing, rather as a flying buttress supports a cathedral. And it is simultaneously our task and the historic task of global Britain to create the conditions for free trade and prosperity, not just in Europe, but across the world. And above all, that means global security, the bedrock of economic success. You'll have seen the Prime Minister's recent successful trip to Washington, where she and President Trump reaffirmed their 100% commitment to NATO. It means we have a vital interest in freedom of navigation and open shipping lanes. And that is why we will shortly have 2 giant aircraft carriers, 70,000 tons apiece, capable of projecting British power worldwide, including through the Malacca Straits, which channel over 25% of global trade. It means helping to fight corruption and bad governance across the world, because that is the way we encourage companies to invest in countries like Ghana and to help drive those populations up the value chain. And my point to you this morning about global Britain is that it's right for Britain too. As other nations rise out of poverty and become more prosperous, so they buy more goods. And of course, it's right that we spend 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid, but it's also a way of spurring on the growth of our export markets. And I can tell you, of all the things that I've seen in my time as Foreign Secretary, one of the most moving things has been the way we are helping kids to go to school in some of the toughest environments in the world. And we are helping literally millions of girls to be educated in the Punjab. 6 million being supported through a DFID program. Everybody in this room should be incredibly proud of what we are doing. But it's also of massive benefit, not just to the people in that part of Pakistan. It's also, and of course, it means that you promote economic growth, you reduce infant mortality, child marriage, so on. You help to contain a rising population and drive up prosperity. But that support is also good for our country as well. I was in the classroom. I asked the girls, as thinking of trying to stump for a question, I said, you know, who's your favourite author? And what do you think they said? That's right, no flies on you. And congratulations to the front row for paying attention. They did. They all as one virtually shouted out J.K. Rowling. They asked them various other questions to which I'm sure you all know the answers about who's the headmaster and so on and so forth. And they all knew that stuff. Well, look, I hope I'm not being vulgar if I say that more sales of Harry Potter worldwide mean more business for UK publishing, don't they? And I hope it's not too crude to say that means more jobs for people in this city. Indeed, more, probably for what I know, more publishers' lunches in Soho. And I hope that's not too crude. I'm not saying that you can draw a straight line from an overflowing classroom in the Punjab to an overflowing restaurant in Dean Street. But the connection is there. Nor, by the way, am I saying that the UK can solve all the world's problems? Certainly not on our own. But we can and we do make a huge difference. And we set a moral and intellectual lead for others to follow. Because there's another feature of the UK which I think people sometimes forget. And that is that Britain is the most global of all the developed economies. You know, there are 6 million Brits. 1 in 10 of the British population who currently live and work, or permanently resident abroad. I don't know, perhaps it's the legacy of empire or some strange wanderlust, but whatever the cause, Britain has a bigger diaspora as a proportion of our population than any other large, rich nation. There are bankers and diplomats and peacekeepers and aid workers, scientists and ski instructors and oilmen and teachers, snooker players, movie stars, rock musicians, artists, poets, water slide testers, chicken sexers for all I know, and perhaps the odd pirate and scoundrel as well. But their presence means that Britain is more plugged in to events in distant countries than any other nation of our size and wealth. And my point to you this afternoon is that historic global quality of Britain, linked umbilically not just to our friends and partners in Europe, but also to the 93% of the world that do not live in the European Union, shortly to be 94%, of course. That global quality of the UK is a fantastic benefit and potential future economic benefit to our country. And our task, obviously, is to ensure that the British people are ready to take advantage of the opportunities that are opening up. And we have a government determined to make sure that Britain works for everyone, to ensure that everyone feels the benefit of our economic success, and we're concentrating on skills, on education, extending the ladder of opportunity to kids who have been failed by previous reforms. We're seeing the biggest programme of infrastructure investment for more than a century. Nuclear power stations, Crossrail 2, high-speed rail, HS2. We're finally getting to grips with our aviation crisis, so that we come up with a right idea, wrong place in my view, but nonetheless, we're making progress. And I know that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, is determined to keep taxes low and the business environment as friendly as possible. And I think we have every reason as a nation to be confident. Many of you were wise enough not to believe those pre-referendum forecasts of economic calamity. And since June the 23rd, the sky has obstinately failed to fall in. We have, the IMF predicts that we'll have the fastest growing economy for 2016. We have the fastest G7 economy, though we didn't until last week, where they slightly changed the figures, like rather the Oscar ceremony. Germany seems to have scooped it for the time being, but we're right up there. We're right up there. And the investment continues to flood in. Huge multi-billion pound investments into our country, some of the biggest that we've ever seen. And of course, we are getting the export ball back over the net. We have who would have thought this 20 years ago? Thanks to the efforts of people in this room, we have a £1.1 billion trade surplus with, guess where? South Korea. British cars being sold in ever-growing quantities to that market. We export tea to China, bikes to Holland, boomerangs to Australia, sand to Saudi Arabia. Or at least we did export sand to Saudi Arabia. I think we still export much sand to Saudi Arabia. But we do still export wine to Italy, and I'm delighted to say Nigel Farage to America, where he may remain. And it is the... And it is the miracle... It is the miracle of globalization, combined with British branding genius, that means we not only every night import pineapples from Ghana, but guess what? We take those pineapples and we alchemically transform them, and we actually export pineapple jam to America. Can you believe that? The Americans... And that's even before we've done a free trade deal. It is an incredible fact that we have a trade surplus running with the United States of more than £30 billion. But they still don't buy our beef. They won't eat our beef yet. And in fact, indeed, they refuse to eat haggis from Scotland so far. And I think you'll agree with me that if they can eat pineapple jam, they can certainly manage haggis. I want to conclude with this thought. Britain is at its best, and all our history teaches us this. Britain is at its best when we are most global in our outlook. And in my time as your Foreign Secretary, it's been almost overwhelming to discover that we have links and friends around the world that we have built up for centuries, and in some ways and in some places that we have almost forgotten, not least in those rapidly growing Commonwealth economies, but also elsewhere. And of course we remain committed to our European markets, perhaps more so than ever, but we need to think globally again, because a global Britain is a safer Britain and a more successful Britain, and above all, a more prosperous Britain. And the same, in my view, goes for the rest of the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for 2 business questions and 2 press questions. So, business question, please.
I cunningly use most of the time.
I need a business question first. Gentleman down here in the front, there's a business questioner, and I need a second business questioner, please. Lady just there as well. Oh, sorry, Laura, no, you're not business. Just hang on. Gentleman just here first, please.
Export, I'll tell you
Indeed. Panel number 2.
Richard Eccles from Bird & Bird. I'd like to ask you a question about the UK's intended free trade agreement with the EU. Based on previous examples of EU free trade agreements, I think we can expect that the EU will want the UK to continue to keep its laws in the single market area in line with EU law in that area. So can I ask, is that what the government negotiating team wants? Does the government team think that it can achieve the close free trade agreement that it wants within 2 years? And what certainty will there be for businesses in trading with the EU if that 2-year objective is not achieved?
Well, thank you. I think that, let's be absolutely clear, we have an unrivaled opportunity that's unlike any other free trade deal the EU has ever done, in the sense that we are already exactly flush with our friends and partners on standards and tariffs and quotas and everything else. There is really no reason at all why that situation should not be protracted, and why we shouldn't be able to do a fantastic deal that is as frictionless as possible for British businesses. Time is you're right. You know, it depends how our friends and partners choose to handle it. They can play it long. They have electoral considerations, as everybody knows. I think there's every reason why we shouldn't go at this full tilt and get it done within 2 years. But let's see how it goes. I had some. I think David Davis and Dexio are doing a fantastic job. I think what's changed since the Lancaster House speech on January the 17th, when the Prime Minister set out her vision for how all this was going to work, is that our friends and partners understand much more clearly what we want to achieve, and they can see much more clearly how it could be made to work in their interests, and why actually a win-win outcome is the best thing for everybody. I'm not saying that it will be, there won't be some bumps in the road, and I'm not saying that from time to time some plaster won't come off the ceiling, but there's a lot of goodwill, and that goodwill is building rather than diminishing.
Thank you. Is that second question? That's a business question here?
Yes.
Excellent.
Hello,
Panel 3.
my name is Anna Kerrod, and I'm from FSU Basel, a legal firm specializing in commercial negotiations in oil and gas sector. Mr. Foreign Secretary, I was very pleased to hear about your view on globalization. That was really refreshing. And my question is, what is your view on the potential for developing stronger links with non-EU countries, particularly countries from the former Soviet Union, such as Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, particularly given their importance in the global energy market? Thank you.
Well, thank you. We are. I won't say that we're absolutely promiscuous in our approach, because that would be to do us an injustice. And clearly, as colleagues will know, we have issues at the moment with Russia in particular, and we have some pretty considerable sanctions on Russia at the moment as a result of their behaviour in Ukraine, and we have absolutely no intention of relaxing those. But when it comes to other potential friends and partners, you mentioned Kazakhstan, other republics, of course we are in the process of intensifying those relationships. I can tell you that Liam Fox and his team, they're not, as you know, they're not technically allowed to ink in deals now. They can't, because that's not allowed under EU law. But there's nothing to stop them doing them in pencil. At all. And with your experience as a trade negotiator, perhaps you could, direct yourself to his door, because we are certainly recruiting at the moment.
Third question just there. Panel number 4, please.
Anushka Rastana from The Guardian. Foreign Secretary, you didn't name the previous Tory leader, Sir John Major, but I suspect you have a thought or two about his recent intervention. You talk about the importance of a trade deal. He says that behind diplomatic civilities, the atmosphere is already sour, and that we could do with a little more charm and a lot less cheap rhetoric. Will you be taking his advice? And do you agree it's not arrogant, brazen or elitist to raise concerns about Brexit?
I think it's very important, Anushka, that as we set out on this journey, that we are positive about the outcome, and for the very good reason that I think the outcome will be fantastic for this country. And as the Prime Minister has said, I think perhaps you've forgotten, Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. And that is the spirit in which we are approaching it. I won't hide it from you that when I became Foreign Secretary 7 months or so ago, and I first went to other European capitals, they were in a state of shock, some of them, of puzzlement. They hadn't expected the Brexit outcome. That mood has almost entirely vanished. And as I said in answer to a question from the previous gentleman, they really want to help us to do a great deal, but also, we mustn't, be too boastful about this, but there is a role for the UK in the stability and prosperity of Europe widely conceived, and there always will be. That my friend Bert Koenders, the Dutch foreign minister, said that as the UK leaves the EU, he said Europe will be losing 20% of its GDP, 25% of its military spending, and 30% of its overseas aid budget. Well, my point to Bert is that is just not true, because we're still going to be there. To all important intents and respects, we are going to be contributing on all those things. Of course, we're going to be a major European economy. Of course, we're going to be contributing through NATO to the stability and security of the EU. And of course, we'll be collaborating with our friends and partners in delivering European objectives around the world. So I think people are starting to get that. And they're starting to understand that there can be a new European partnership between Britain and the EU that is good for the EU and good for the UK, that you can have a strong EU and a strong UK.
Foreign Secretary, final question I've got just at the back, panel number 3, please.
Adam Parsons from Sky News. George Osborne has just told this audience that Brexit is the biggest act of protectionism in the UK's history. Wouldn't it be more honest to tell business leaders in this room that some of them will do better and some of them will do worse? Well,
I'm afraid I don't know whether you're accurately represent. I can find it inconceivable that you could be accurately representing. I'm so, gentleman in the middle there is shaking his head, my dear friend, and saying that you have not quoted my old mate George entirely accurately. But let us suppose that those were indeed his words, which I do not for a moment accept. I don't think that's true. I think that Brexit, as I say, is an opportunity for a great free trading country, a country that built its wealth and its success on free trade, once again to be the world's leading agitator and champion for free trade. And I hope what I've been able to show you, or to explain to you this morning, is the government's strong, strong view that global Britain, acting in the interests of the world's security, projecting our values overseas, and campaigning for a global, open world is the way forward. That's what we want to follow, and I can't believe for a second that, as I say, those were the words of my old friend George, but if they were, then I could not fail to disagree with you more.
Ladies and gentlemen, we could ask questions of the Foreign Secretary over your entire lunch break, but I am afraid we are, in fact, out of time. Please join me in thanking once again the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Boris Johnson.
We will make America great again.